Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the special meeting of the Fort Ord Reuse Authority Board of Directors. Call the meeting to order. Participating via teleconference is Jane Parker and Marianne Carbone from the Yosemite Valley Lodge. I don't know why they're calling in. They could be having a good time. So we'll please stand if you're able for the Pledge of Allegiance, and if Alan Hoffa will please lead us.
States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, and Cynthia Garfield, too. Acknowledgements, announcements, and correspondence.
Yes, just to add, Chair, I think Pacific Grove Representative Cynthia Garfield is also on the phone. She is entertaining us from New Orleans. So, as the chair said,
Yeah, well, it may sound a little cold.
just one quick note: we did get comments that we had some problems with people reading page 2 of different parts of this. Wherever we could, we tried to correct that. I know Heidi tells me that we haven't made any changes on the web, but we do know that the final version was readable, and we apologize if that caused any problems, the inability to get page 2 within the actual legislative language. But if anybody had that, did anyone else have that problem? Okay, well, my apology. 2 and 4. Okay, so our apologies for that. And Chair, that's all I have under acknowledgments, announcements, correspondence.
The clerk will do roll call, please.
Supervisor Parker?
Here.
Thank you. Supervisor Phillips?
He's on his way.
Supervisor Adams? Councilmember John Gagliotti? Councilmember Frank O'Connell?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Gail Morton?
Here.
Councilmember Alan Hoffa? Here. Mayor Ian Oglesby? Here. Councilmember John Wizard? Here. Mayor Marianne Carbone?
Here.
Mayor Joe Gunter?
Here.
Councilmember Cynthia Garfield?
Here.
Kathleen Lee? Oh, Marina. Thank you. Nicole Hollingsworth? Erica Parker? Mike Zeller? Dr. P.K. Diffenbaugh?
Here.
Steve Matarazzo?
Here.
Dr. Eduardo Ochoa? Colonel Greg Ford?
Here.
Bill Collins? Dr. Walter Triblee? Lisa Reinheiner? And Dr. Matt Zefferman.
Excuse me, I don't think my name was called.
Oh, I apologize.
Jan
Councilmember
Ramers,
Jan
Carmel.
Ramers.
Thanks.
And John Phillips just arrived.
You have a quorum.
Thank you.
I am.
Next item will be item 5, will be the business items, information and action. These are for board discussions, debate, directions to staff, and/or action, and comments from the public are not to exceed 3 minutes, or as other word determined by the chair. So we're going to start off with item A, 2019 legislative agenda, transition draft, and legislative language and recommendation. And turn it over to the staff.
Yes, Chair and members of the board, this is a single item agenda, although there are 4 subheadings in today's agenda for your consideration. Sherry Damon will provide a presentation specifically going over the language as she did for the Legislative Committee on Monday. I want to highlight a couple of quick things. There have been a lot of questions posed and letters written that the language that you received is an extension of FORA. I want it understood clearly that we have 15 months, 15 days, and 15 hours, and FORA as an organization goes away. it sunsets. The language is proposed specifically to address issues in the 2018 transition plan, which call for potential legislative action and at the direction of our legislative offices that have a specific deadline on when that can be submitted. So if this board is to have the option for any of the transition activities to occur, they have to get language in now. And this is at the direction of the board to bring this language back for full board debate and deliberation. And so Sherry will take you through the individual items. There's been some attempts to address items that we heard at last week's board meeting, as well as items that we received in the mail from other stakeholders and colleagues. Sherry.
Thank you. Good morning, members of the board, members of the public. Sherry Damon, your risk manager and prevailing wage coordinator. I'll try to make it quick, but I've got 30 slides, so hold on. And my clicker is not working. Let's. Technical difficulties. Hang tight.
Chair, if I
Can you
may,
just click?
while she's doing that, I just wanted to point out that in the staff report, it made reference to questions from City of Marina. I don't want to take credit, but I will take the blame. The questions came from me, not from any other council member. We didn't meet and make a decision as to how to submit these questions. But also, I believe on staff report, page 5, says the legislative committee was unanimous in their desires to not have a weighted vote. That's inaccurate. I never said that was in favor of each vote separate. I, in fact, voted against this, and I am considering weighted vote being proper. So just one for the record. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Let's hope that the clicker works. So this is what I'm going to talk about very quickly. We're going to go over the 2019 legislative agenda that this board considered at its March 8th meeting. Just the language of the position on item A as it related to the 2018 transition plan. The key legislative dates, the draft legislative agenda language, and the comparison of the pre-June 30th, 2020 organization versus the post-FORA, the post-June 30th, 2020 organization. So this was your position statement in the 2019 legislative agenda, and in particular, there are 6 areas of what I call issues that at a high level you want to focus on from a policy level. I'm not going to go over those, but suffice it to say that the draft legislative language attempts to address some or all of those policy positions. All right, this one's just, go ahead and laugh. It's okay. This is how bills become laws. And it's the, rainbow caterpillar. It's here, there, everywhere. It's a messy process. I'm going to streamline our process for our purposes and our dates. You have bill introduction, you have committee hearings, you have floor hearings, ultimately, hopefully culminating in a signed piece of law by the governor on October 13th. You can see it's a very short, relatively short time frame. Here are our specific dates. In order to get a bill introduced, Senator Monning's office needs to have language no later than March 22nd. April 1st through the 26th are those policy committee reviews. And in between that time frame is a spring recess. Nobody's going to consider anything from April 11th through the 22nd. So you can see there's a very short, that window of policy time is shortened by the spring recess. You've got about a little less than a month for fiscal committee review. This bill most likely will have fiscal impact, so it will be reviewed in the Appropriations Committee. May 13th through May 3rd through September 13th are those floor hearings. That's both the Senate and the House. Back and forth. There's some committee re-referrals process. I've taken out some of the caterpillar in order to streamline this and make it fit on one slide. You've got a summer recess in the middle of summer, July 12th through the August 12th, and finally October 13th is your last day for the governor to sign. So that being said, let's talk about what everybody really wants to talk about, the draft legislation. Because if you don't submit anything to our legislative offices and get it in the process, you don't have anything. So generally, this is the overview, and I'm going to skip the overview. It's here, but we're going to go right to A. I'm going to take you section by section through this bill, or through this draft legislation. So Section A is the primacy clause. It tries to establish that this new piece of 67-700 is what's going to govern the dissolution and the actions of the FORA board going forward post June 30th, 2020. It's a clear demarcation line, and it sets that these guidelines, these rules will govern over everything else in the Authority Act. A comment was raised about a date. Why wasn't there a date in the original? So the original is on the top. Some suggested revisions might be the authority's operation and dissolution beginning July 1st, 2020. So there's your date as a possible consideration. On your dais before you, in order to compile these in a comprehensive manner, there is also a table which shows the current draft legislation in the left-hand column, and it compiles all of the potential changes you might wish to consider in the right-hand column. It's designed to help make it easier as we go through the discussion points. Section B, this is your definitions clause. It has multiple definitions that are tailored to this section and are maybe somewhat different from definitions that are in the earlier part of the Act. A comment was raised about entitled development, and so we are considering, or think a consideration might be to qualify that entitled development means that development or entitlements that are issued prior to June 30th, 2020. Again, that clear demarcation line. That's what we're talking about. We are not talking about an extension of this FORA organization in the way it is now, where it reviews land use decisions. We're talking about a clear demarcation between pre-2020 and post-2020. And we are limiting the purposes of that. Transition plan, also, you might consider amending the definition to mean that plan that was adopted on December 19th, 2018, as it may be amended prior to, again, June 30th, 2020. So just keeping consistent. If the board wishes to let the successor board make amendments to the transition plan post June 30th, 2020, which I'm not certain where y'all are going to fall out on that issue, you could take that language out. Paragraph C is a statement of the existing, more or less the existing law that talks about 18 months. Again, this paragraph could be amended to qualify that the transition plan is the one that was adopted prior to June 30th, 2020. So you could use similar language to what we just talked about to modify this. This language would allow an amendment of the transition plan post June 30th, 2020 unless it's changed. Paragraph D is the CEQA clarification that we heard lots about during the adoption of the transition plan process. This clarifies that the transition plan that's been adopted is exempt from CEQA. That argument has been made, but this just clarifies it in state law. And it also codifies and clarifies that the changes in organization post June 30th, 2020 are also exempt. And that is a reflection of both the CEQA exemption laws and the CEQA statute. Paragraph E this is where you start to see the limitation of the organization. This is the general statement of what your authority would be post June 30th, 2020, and that is to continue the authority CFD, to collect and distribute the CFD revenues, to collect and distribute or disperse the property tax revenues, and to manage and oversee the implementation of the transition plan. All three of those things are issues that we heard during the adoption of the transition plan, and we've heard subsequently as well as continuing issues. And again, this is the general statement, so we did have a question about whether or not this paragraph was inconsistent with another paragraph that specifically lists what the authority may do or not do post-June June 30th, 2020. Paragraph F, this is your board composition and the voting. So some of the issues that we heard during the adoption of the transition plan, do we have to have 2 votes for everything? One of the big issues. And so this is clear, it's a majority vote. We also heard during the adoption of the transition plan from members of CSUMB and others that they would like to be a part of the board. There's a policy decision to be made here. We've included some alternative language in the table, which deletes CSUMB from the board, which addresses, I think, whether or not a majority, it would be easier to have a majority vote than because an odd number of folks on the board, it's easier to get a majority. You don't have the possibility of a deadlock, a 3-3 deadlock. There are other ways to address a 3-3 deadlock. One of them is weighted voting, and overwhelmingly, with the exception of Councilmember O'Connell, thank you very much for clarifying that, the legislative committee members were against that weighted voting suggestion at that point in time. But they hadn't heard this presentation, so they might change their mind. I don't know. They're a committee. Specific authorities. Here is your list of specific authorities. This is exactly what your successor board would be empowered to do. And I think it's pretty straightforward. Implementing the transition plan, collecting the community facilities district fees, managing the community facilities district, because let's face it, it is always intended that the CFD is going to go away. We know it's going to go away. It's been planned to, it would have been nice to have been planned to go away with all of the replacement revenue generation and revenue sharing agreements in place, but that hasn't happened. So the idea here is as replacement revenue streams come online and replacement agreements come online, the CFD boundaries can be automatically shrunken. And there are some language amendments that we are suggesting here in response to comments raised by Landwatch about the authority in Mello-Roos to automatically modify or reduce the boundaries of a CSD district. So we are suggesting some language change to this section that would allow that to happen. So as the CFD taxes are paid, and as replacement financing is in play and everybody's insured about that, happy about that, we can make appropriate reductions. So this is not expansion of the CFD. This is not adding any new projects to the CFD. This is not adding any new programs that would be funded by the CFD. This is a transition CFD that's designed to shrink as the replacement funding mechanisms and the shortfalls are fully addressed to accomplish the regional needs of the transition. The next paragraph, where am I? A lot of paragraphs here. Paragraph I, is that right? Yep, it's I. So this is the powers section. I noted that the City of Marina today handed out a letter that talked about the unfetteredness of the powers, or that it's not clear somehow that this section. This section is designed to give flexibility to the successor board, but at the same time limit the use of those powers to only those things that is authorized to do. So it is not an unfettered power. I can do whatever I want as a successor board. This is tempered by the limited nature of what this successor would do, what the successor board would do. Collect the CFD and distribute and manage the CFD, prepare the escrow, the contingency account that's funded by the property tax revenues, and deals with the transition plan. And that is why the transition plan is specifically called out in this section about participating in litigation, because transition plan was not really fundamental part of the original legislation. It is more a creature of this body, which is transitioning. And then a budget. I'm assuming everybody would like this organization's successor to be creating a budget to establish how it is operating. I would note also that there are provisions in this, maybe not in this section, but in another section, actually it's in this section, about contracting with any underlying land use jurisdiction to assist in the completion of the tasks. I read one of the letters said that, you know, this is just an ongoing FORA and you're going to have staff, you know, it's not clear. The idea here is to give that successor board the option to use their own staff if they choose to fulfill their duties that way, to contract with a contractual staffing agency, or to retain staff if that's what they need to do to implement it. Whichever works best for the successor board, I think, is the big push here, and we've tried to build that in. We've also noted in the staff report, and I think it's really important for the public and everybody else to understand, this board has initiated the termination process for the CalPERS contract with its existing employees. It's slated to go through the process, ultimately terminating on June 30th, 2020. At that point in time, if the successor board wishes to retain employees, they're going to have to address that issue, either how retirement will be funded, or if there's going to be retirement, or what's going to happen. So this is not just business as usual. Regional planning. This is to address this section tries to address the policy issue that came up during the adoption of the transition plan. Does the base reuse plan policies, programs survive post June 30th, 2020? Balanced with some of the other comments that we heard, the jurisdictions want to be able to do what they want to do without having the oversight of a FORA board or a regional body telling them what they can and cannot do. This language basically creates a transition safety net. It puts the reuse plan in play, but it allows the replacement plans to be adopted and take the place of the reuse plan as those plans go through their own environmental review process. So, and they're updated. The only thing additional that the board might consider putting on top of this, and we didn't even write it, is the compilation of a regional map. I do think that it would be a nice benefit to have an entity that publishes whatever the new plans are and shows it as part of the whole Fort Ord Reuse Authority or the Fort Ord District map. Not any approval, disapproval, nothing more than just ministerially compiling it and putting it out there. Paragraph 2 of this section really deals with the policies. What policies do we really, really, really want to make sure continue? We heard affordable housing, the 20% affordable housing requirement of the base reuse plan, and the payment of prevailing wages on first-generation construction. This does not deal with the issue of enforcement. I know the building trades would like to see some stronger language in here that says something like, you know, prevailing wage on first-generation projects and that the underlying land use jurisdictions shall enforce. We are not proposing that language at this time, but, you know, we don't have control when this goes to Sacramento either. So we tried to keep it very focused here on the regional planning policies. Regional funding. This is how you replace the funding that is provided and the resources that are provided by the FORA CFD and by the property tax revenues. So, and it tries to get to what we're going to use this for without unduly tying the hands of either the successor board or the region to address regional need shortfalls that may not be addressed as those replacement regional funding mechanisms come on play. And I've outlined a couple of examples in my staff report. So a really good example, I think, of this is with respect to transit. TAMSI has a replacement program. We've seen some of the replacement program or the draft program. We know that it doesn't dollar for dollar match. The projects don't match the ones that are in the FORA CFD. It does have a provision for the Monterey Salinas Transit Agency, but it's short. So under the FORA CFD program, we generate about $16 million for the MST operations and bus replacement program. Under the TAMSI regional replacement program, it can only generate about $7 million. So there's a $9 million shortfall for MST. It's a regional need. That's what this is designed to catch. We are suggesting an amendment to these two sections, though, because comments were raised that somehow the successor board would have this unfettered discretion to determine the regional needs. That really isn't the intent of this board, at least not in the way I've drafted it. The board could change that, of course, but we are suggesting that the boards determine those regional needs in consultation with the regional entities to address any shortfalls in the revenue generation for those needs. So the idea here is a coordination and collaboration as we transition to another form of revenue generation and revenue sharing, and we limit it to habitat conservation, transportation, transit, and water supply augmentation. That's the suggested change to this to help clarify that this is not unfettered. We're going to do whatever we want to do. Paragraph K2 deals with how you determine that pro rata basis. And there was some concerns raised that maybe the pro rata basis, again, there would be unfettered discretion by the successor board to say, oh, you know what, you guys have to pay a little more. And it would become more of a political conversation. So we are suggesting that the pro rata basis also be determined with two pieces. One is in consultation with the regional entity, the regional service providers, revenue generators, and with respect to the transition plan implementing agreements. So the parties that have agreements in play that require revenue sharing, we want to make sure, again, this is the safety net. This is to make sure that everything has been addressed. So 2 prongs, and if both of those are satisfied that the replacement revenue is in play, then the successor board, the suggestion is the successor board may not deny approval of the replacement funding mechanism, even if you don't like it. If everybody else is happy with it, the board has to approve it if you have agreement between those two prongs. Just a suggestion, it's not but it would get to the unfettered discretion to do whatever we want to do option or interpretation. Dissolution. This is also a interestingly discussed topic. You'll note there's no end date and there's no 80% when the base is 80% reused language. Having an artificial end date has kind of gotten us in trouble in the past. But that being said, we've tried to craft what I call performance objectives here. What is it that we're trying to accomplish with this agency? Well, we have a set of things, but it's mainly a financial entity. So when all the CFDs are collected on entitled development, and now that definition could be changed to limit it to June 30th, 2020. So that's a definable, articulable number. Or when substitute funding mechanisms have been implemented. So this is the flexibility that is in full control of the underlying land use jurisdictions. Marina, for example, already has one of those replacement funding mechanisms, I think, in play, which is their agreement with the Sea Haven, I think that's right, the Sea Haven developers to not oppose. Now, I don't know if that's quite enough, but that's definitely one of the things that I think about when I think of what's a substitute for the FORA CFD. Well, you've got some language already in an agreement there. There are 2 other approved developments, or at least one other one that I know about that still needs a written agreement. But it's in the control of the underlying agencies to bring those forward. Other ones, there are other examples of things than just contractual agreement. It could be a CRIA. It could be, which is a financing mechanism, a community reinvestment authority, which is a mechanism that is one possible alternative, or another CFD, another community facilities district. So those are substitute financing mechanisms. Again, those are within the control of the jurisdictions to form and to bring forward. Revenue sharing agreements, those are in control, full control of the parties to agree. ESCA is going to be assigned. There, yeah, we've got that one in there, ESCA, just in case it doesn't get assigned for any reason. We've left this in here as a potential, but it's everybody's expectation that it's assigned to Seaside. And the only one that's really not within the control of any local agency to do is the last one. The transfer of property from the federal government to the underlying jurisdictions is completed. There are cleanup sites that are still out there, and we do anticipate that all property will not be transferred prior to June 30th, 2020. We don't expect that to take an extraordinarily long time past that date, but one of the issues that we heard during the adoption of the transition process, the plan, is the need for a local reuse authority, which is a federally designated entity, a single entity to interface with the Army and take property. We also heard from some of the underlying land use jurisdictions that they did not want to be the primary recipient of certain property from the Army. So, you know, this is an attempt to try to get to that issue. 2, 3, and 4 are what's the backup plan? If you meet all those requirements, the property is transferred, but the job is maybe not quite yet perfectly done, Monterey County is the backup plan, basically. They distribute your CFD dollars, they collect your property tax revenues until everything is addressed. And that goes hand in hand a little bit with the LAFCO FORA issues, and we've got some specific language in the paragraph that deals with the LAFCO FORA interactions. And here it is, LAFCO Oversight. So paragraph 1 is what it says now, the state legislation, this is what it says. Paragraph 2 is an elaboration of how it's intended to work. And I will say this is loosely patterned. You know, I'd like to say I'm really brilliant, but I'm not. It's really loosely patterned after what happened when redevelopment agencies went away. And FORA is not a redevelopment agency. This is just an example of how we're doing it. You had a successor entity and you had an oversight board. Here we have a successor board. The legal reason for that is the continuation of the CFD, and we have an oversight entity that is LAFCO. So what will happen is every year the successor board will provide a report to LAFCO that says these are how many revenues we've collected, this is what we've distributed, this is where we are with transition plan implementing agreements or the transition plan, here's what's outstanding. I think that's a comprehensive board. It's a check and a balance to make sure that we are moving through the process as was envisioned. There is an amendment that we are suggesting to this section, though, that I think was just an oversight, and that is what happens if in that final year, we send the report to LAFCO, and LAFCO says, you know what, good try, but you need to do A, B, and C. There was nothing in this section that dealt with that, so now there is. We are suggesting that the authority shall take all necessary and appropriate action to address the commission's comments and shall make provision to. So a small thing, but basically it's how that relationship works, what happens if they disagree, what happens next. Remember, this is state legislation. So I did read some comments about what's the process for this, what's the process for that, and just like FORA adopted its own operating resolution and its rules and how things worked inside the agency, it's fully contemplated that this successor board would do something similar and work together to do the process that it's going to use with those 5 or 6 folks on the board as it moves forward in finally transitioning FORA out of existence and having replacement revenue generation, revenue sharing mechanisms in place. So we were asked to kind of do a comparison, what it looks like now versus what the organization looks like after this legislation. And you can see all the little green dots on the left-hand side. Those are all the things that FORA does now. And this is not an exhaustive list. I will just tell you, I could not fit on one page every single little thing that FORA does now. But I can fit pretty much what they're going to do, the successor board does. And you can see it, it's substantially limited. This is not an extension of FORA. This is a limited scope extension to accomplish the purposes, the very limited purposes of the financial safety net and that allows the parties to move forward, finish their agreements, get their replacement plans in place without having a big financial black eye. And it addresses the contingent liability issue because it has that mechanism for property tax collection. And so here's what we're asking you today, to approve some draft legislative language, whether it's the one that was submitted in the packet or as amended with the amendments that we suggested. And again, I've got the table in front of the board for your consideration. Approve the 2019 legislative agenda, item A. That's that one section. It's not just the piece that I showed you on the slide. It's the piece that's in your board report that you excised out of the legislative agenda on Friday, March 8th. And direct that we submit all of those, both of those, to the legislative offices in Sacramento and get the process started. And then direct staff to come back and give you status updates on how it's going. And I am available with this beautiful sunset over Fort Ord to answer any questions.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm going to go to board members for questions, and I'll start on my right. You're up, sir.
I think the CFD it's been one of the most functional parts of the FORA in its 21 years, and you know, it's provided the capital needs for jurisdictions. I think that going forward, it would do the same. The proposed legislation here, as I see this, and as it was just presented here by staff, I mean, it distills the FORA agency down to its most functional elements. It'll allow us the autonomy to develop. It'll collect fees for habitat and give us the flexibility. It'll eliminate the overhead costs and the PERS obligations. It's not incentivized to continue beyond the build-outs. And we have a deadline to act, you know? I mean, we have a very, very short timeline. There's no runway here whatsoever. The CFD is beneficial to all the land use jurisdictions. And so, I mean, it's for that reason that are expressed. I move to accept the staff recommendations and the legislative language with the alternatives that are put in here and get this to Bill Monning's office.
Thank you. Comments from my...
Comments or questions?
Questions? Any questions?
Recognized, Chair.
In one moment, we'll deal with our friends on the phone. I have people in the room that are waving their arms at me. Go right ahead.
Okay.
Have another drink.
Okay.
Julia.
This is Jan Ramers for those who aren't in the room. I agree. I think that the staff has done a wonderful job of laying this out for us, and we have to take an action, and I think the action that they're recommending today is the way we need to go. I would like to see CSUMB stay in the mix. That is a personal opinion. I also remember another reason for a successor agency to move forward is Mr. Monning's suggestion some months ago that a unit going for federal funding or any kind of funding will be more effective than individual jurisdictions. And I want very much, as an outsider to the jurisdictions, to see the jurisdictions have the control and be able to move forward. And I think this is the very best step for that to happen. So I'm very much in favor of moving forward with this.
Alan?
So my question has to do with the entitled projects, and in the past, we've heard our friends from Marina say that they were working on some sort of a contract with developers to ensure the funding that those developers are responsible for paying, the impacts of their development would be paid, and that the debts to the region would be fulfilled. So my question is, have we seen that contract? I don't believe it's been presented to FORA yet, and if staff could respond to that. If we don't move forward legislation, how confident are we that the $70 million that is needed will be funded in some other way?
You always like to ask the tough questions. Actually, staff has seen, I think we at one point either commented on it or presented it during a board meeting on the 2018 transition plan, and the one page. So there's one written agreement that we have seen. It does have a limitation of capping the replacement fees at the level of the FORA CFD fees as of June 30th, 2020. And it has another limitation in the language that I saw that would limit the distribution of any replacement mechanism to collect those fees to only regional needs or regional. It had some language that I would have liked to have seen a little broader myself, but it was a regional provider, a regional assessor. And I remember thinking it was a TAMSI. It was a limitation to TAMSI, but that's only one, and I have not seen any other replacement writings.
Dr. Tribally?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure that I voice very strongly that the CSU Chancellor, CSU MB, should stay in this voting group. I mean, FORA has started for education, economy, and the environment. If we're concerned about breaking a tie, you can add MPC, or you could add one of the other education entities that have hundreds of acres set aside for habitat, which this new group will be presiding over. So certainly MPC already has 200 acres set aside for that. University of California has about 500, and we're looking at even more for wildlife corridors. And a large part of what this group's going to do is oversee habitat. We need to have a voice at the table. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Cynthia, who's in the wings. Cynthia, you're up.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with going forward with something. I do have to express I think a white-held sense of frustration with I expected to be able to have consultation with my counsel, and I don't understand how going forward we might be able to adjust small changes in language to course correct during this legislative process? Or is this our one shot to put language forward and then we live with the results? And so if I can get an answer to that question, then I either will or won't have nitpicky details.
Do you want to take that, Michael, or do you want me to take it?
I can take a shot at our experience over the course of 22 years that any language that gets submitted doesn't look anything like it on the other end. And there are steps in the process where entities have individual opportunity to contribute. I would assume that once language gets submitted, individual interests are going to represent their concerns to the folks in the legislature. My experience, and we have representatives from the legislative offices here, they would probably, I think they're shaking their head, whether it's folks that are in this room or even not in the room will have input on that process. And there is an iterative process that goes back and forth between for a board, as we did in 2012, or or individual jurisdictions and the legislature. So I would say this isn't the last opportunity, but this does frame the context of what you're going to talk about.
Thank you. Then I will confine my suggestions to one specific one. Is that throughout the draft, there is language that says things like on number E and specific authority slide number 7, it says that the authority shall continue to, and then it details what it shall continue to do. That speaks to this being a continuation of FORA. And I just think that the language could be cleaned up and crisper about this issue, that there's a cessation of FORA and this is an establishment of a new entity. And I think that that would assuage a lot of frustration on what this really is. But other than that, I would agree with we should go forward and because of the importance of preserving the resources and financing. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to our friend from Marina. Gail's been waiting patiently.
Thank you. So the City of Marina has concerns with this legislation as the extension of FORA. I have some specific questions to ask. The Authority Act is Government Code Section 67700 at sequence. My question is, the revisions that are in front of us modify 67700. Are the other provisions then remain unmodified and they sunset as of January 1st, 2021?
No, that's not correct.
That's my concern.
That's not correct, but that's why this language says and why it was suggested that you amend paragraph A. 67700 is what is now known as the dissolution paragraph. It would continue to be the dissolution paragraph, and it would make clear that everything else in the Authority Act is governed after June 30th, 2020, by the provisions in 6700. That's the way this is drafted. So you could go through and repeal certain sections. So if it were very concerning about consistency or developing a regional plan, the legislature will most likely go in and say this section is repealed because that is not within the powers of the successor board. But at this stage, that's not what I'm proposing, because keep it simple first, and then you clean that up. That's a cleanup, what I would consider a cleanup.
Okay, so my next question is, do member dues continue post June 30th, 2020?
The member dues do not continue. We are very limited to CFD and to property tax and to transition plan. None of those things deal with member dues.
So.
No.
Thank you. That's in the rest of the act. That's part of the reason I'm asking that. What are the jurisdictions obligating? They're obligating to pay CFD revenues solely?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So currently, FORA collects dues, FORA collects CFD revenues, FORA collects tax increment and franchise fees. The question I'm asking is, which of those funding mechanisms would be required of cities? Oh, the other thing is you get 50% of our land sale revenues. So I'm trying to find out, in your intention in this legislation, what is the scope of the commitment from every jurisdiction to fulfill what you're envisioning?
So this language is very narrowly tailored. It does not deal with land sales revenues. That part goes away after June 30th, 2020. This is intended to deal with the extension of the Community Facilities District and the management of that district. So it does need to be managed. It deals with the contingent, what I call the contingent, the funding for the contingent liabilities, and the mechanism for that is the property tax revenues. It continues to collect that, evaluate that, distribute that as appropriate, and maintain that escrow account, if you will, for those kinds of who manages and who pays for litigation, who manages and who pays if there's a CalPERS shortfall, who manages, who pays post June 30th, 2020 for indemnifying LAFCO. That's funded by those property tax revenues. And then transition plan, anything that's left. So there are a whole bunch of things in the transition plan that still have to happen, those transition plan implementing agreements, things like that, making sure that all the little I's and little T's are crossed. And as we went through with the transition plan, and as we are learning, as the jurisdictions are starting to finally read the contracts that they will be responsible for maybe taking on, little details are starting to come out. And so that's what it is designed to address, those three very limited areas. So no land sales revenues, no member dues, no real staffing unless the successor board chooses to go forward with that in some way. But we've empowered this agency to either contract with a contractor to do the work, use their own staff of any of the members, contract with any of the member jurisdictions to do their own work, or do the work that is necessary, or to retain an employee if they wish to do that.
So the sourcing for all of your operational costs, including potentially CalPERS, should the board elect to do that, all of that funding would be from tax increment.
Or borne by the underlying land use jurisdictions.
So you're asking the jurisdictions then to contribute funds?
If you agree to do that, that's certainly one of the things the successor board might decide to do. So that would be a cost to you, but it is not a mandated cost, because if the successor board came to Marina and said, hey, could we use your accounting department to do A, B, or C, Marina is certainly within its capacity to say, you know what, no, we're not going to bear that cost. And so then the successor board would look at its other options available.
So would tax increment also be applied to fulfillment of the CFD?
Again, that is something the successor board would need to consider.
Okay, so will the CFD collected by this new agency be more than the CFD established by FORA as of June 30th, 2020?
No, I don't believe so.
So the current fee of $24,000 residential permit, you pay $24,000, doesn't fully fund the CFD, the CIP program. Where is the envisioning in that, meeting that shortfall if in fact jurisdictions are not required to put in additional funds?
I think that is a discussion that the transition plan implementing agreements will need to address, is to the issue of how jurisdictions will utilize the resources available to them. There is no prohibition, though, I will say, on the successor from applying for grant money and using its designation as the local reuse authority, because that is something that it's designated. It's a state designation, from using that in conjunction with the City of Marina or some other regional partner to go out and get grant funding to address regional need shortfalls.
So your slide at page 11, where you state the dissolution, the authority will be dissolved, and you indicate that this is within the control of each jurisdiction. So, and you point out that if we, as a jurisdiction, any jurisdiction, will come up with an alternative funding mechanism, we may opt out, is my understanding, is what you represented. I want to look at that slide, because when I'm looking at that slide, it says the occurrence of all of the following, which precludes the ability of any jurisdiction to set up a funding mechanism and opt out until the federal government transfers all land, until ESCA. Those are all, as each and every one of those options has to be performed. Is that correct?
That's the way it's currently drafted,
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
This is Jane. Could I ask a couple questions?
Sure, go right ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I have two questions. Sherry, by saying that the extension of the base reuse plan continues the requirement for affordable housing and prevailing wage, are you representing to the board that that language is in the reuse plan?
Yes, those two policies are a combination of in the reuse plan and in the master resolution. So you might recall that during the transition plan adoption, issues were raised about both of those. You know, and one recommendation at one point was to record the master resolution. There was some pushback on that. This is designed to say, okay, we've got two big issues, affordable housing, prevailing wage. There are probably a lot more really important policies, but these are the two legislatively that you would be required to address as the replacement plans come on board.
Thank you. Thank you. There's no mention of the settlement agreement, and anyway, so I will have some comments later. So then another question I have is the definition that you have for entitled development seems to include projects that have land use plans but no developer yet, such as Cypress Knolls. And I recall in the past you've listed Cypress Knolls as being entitled. Is that correct under this definition? And if so, then couldn't this new version of FORA last another 10, 20, 30 years?
Actually, I think that it's really, we tried to be very clear that the maybe we could make this even clearer by saying there's no active subdivision map. I think this interplays the dichotomy between what FORA considers entitled for purposes of consistency and what is legally considered entitled. So the purpose of this language and the purpose of this legislation really has to do with making sure that there is a fee collection mechanism. If the city of Marina has Cypress Knolls, for example, the subdivision map, it's my understanding, has expired, and a new developer will have to come in and there will be a new discretionary approval with new discretionary conditions. I think that that would fall out of this definition. It would not be considered entitled by this definition. Does that make sense? I'm not sure that makes sense, but does that make sense to you?
Councilmember Wizard, you're up, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a question along the lines of Director Garfield's comment about subsection E of 67700 of the Government Code related to the way that it's currently worded in the draft or proposed legislation. The authority shall continue in existence and so forth. So it seems to me that it was always contemplated as a binary choice between either FORA or not FORA. And I'm curious to know, with a more than $21 billion surplus in the state of California, has staff ever contemplated just asking the state of California to give us $70 or $80 million to fund the habitat, to fund the water augmentation, maybe $195 million to fund the CIP as it stays today? I mean, with as much money as the governor is throwing around, why have we not just asked if they'll just take care of this? Because there's such an economic benefit to the state of California to have the Monterey Peninsula and the county of Monterey be whole with the dissolution of the former Fort Ord. Has staff ever contemplated that approach?
I can tell you that during some initial conversations on the capital improvement program, because at one point in time we were talking about with the state legislative offices, and they basically said there are certain things that they consider statewide issues and certain things that are considered local issues. So staff has not really considered or actually written a letter to say, hey, please give us $194.5 million. Please give us, $18 million for additional water supply. Hey, give us so much for any specific thing. That being said, we have applied for certain state grants and some other things to help with our funding obligations over the years. And let me just note that I understand that there is a grave concern that somehow this is a continuation of FORA because of the language. That is by legal requirement. FORA does have to continue in a legal form in order to continue the CFD. That is why the language says continue. But that being said, that doesn't mean it's an unfettered agency that looks like it does today or performs the same functions that it does today. It is limited in scope. So this is an attempt to balance the language of what is legally required to continue the CFD with what we are hearing. We don't want an agency to continue. We need to go out of existence, but we need that financial safety net until the replacement mechanisms are in play.
Through the chair. So I appreciate your response, Ms. Damon. I know to me it seems as though these are statewide issues. Affordable housing is every day in the news. We're hearing about it. We recently, as a state, enacted the Sustainable Groundwater Management Authority, or Act rather. So water is an issue that is at the heart of some of our issues. The Strategic Growth Council, with their charge to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increasing multimodal transit options for people in California, these are all issues the state is focused on. And so to say that we're applying for grants or could apply for grants when these issues are germane to the benefit of the people of the state of California, I think is closing doors on oneself. And so I think that there is value in presenting these to the legislature as statewide issues. And I don't know that it hurts to ask Senator Monning's office to consider whatever it is the board here votes on today, but also just a financial remedy to the generations-long plague that has affected our community.
I think if one were to look at our legislative agenda and the structure of it, it includes specifically the request for funding for affordable housing for all of the elements that are part of what we need to do to complete the recovery program. So embodied in your question is, what are we doing? And to extend Sherry's remarks from earlier, I would just add that over the course of the last decade, 9 different times at the board's direction, I've testified on behalf of getting more dollars from the state for military-based reuse and recovery programs. And so that's consistent with board policy, what you're talking about, and for a staff, to the extent that we're here for 15 months, 15 days, and 15 hours, we'll continue to pursue that.
Yes, sir, Mayor.
I'm not sure if it's 15 hours or 14 hours and 45 minutes. You need to, once in a while you need to check to make sure you're right there.
It's now 13 hours.
Just a quick pointed question for Ms. Damon is, we had a couple letters from Land Watch dated March 11th and March 14th. And I know you've been including some of their comments and you addressed some of their comments, but could you quickly just tell us about some of the language that you adopted or things you changed? Not all of them, because I know we changed a lot. But is there one or two that we just couldn't get over or adopt just because it was just, for lack of a better word, a poison pill? But what I want to get to is, what's left that we can't do that they suggest we should do, other than not adopt it at all? Is there one or two highlights that you just see that that they requested that we do that we just can't do because it just wouldn't make sense if we move forward?
I think the biggest ask, one of the asks that they had asked for, actually involves the CEQA exemption, and that is something that during the adoption of the transition plan was hotly discussed amongst the attorney group and others as we went forward. And at that time, the consensus was that legislative clarification that clarifies the transition plan is not a project under CEQA. Clarification of the CEQA statute. I know Land Watch has requested, or the Land Watch attorney has requested some language which would kind of change or more specifically articulate state law. I think the language that we've proposed is just as clear, if not clearer, and accomplishes what the attorney group had requested. But that being said, this is more than less a statement of state law in that, to the extent that changes in organization, LAFCO uses a similar exemption when it goes through and it looks at reorganizations of districts. There's a CEQA exemption that applies. This just clarifies it's not a project. And, oh, by the way, future changes in organization are exempt. They fall into the same exemption that they would fall in. So we think this language is just as good, if not better, than the Land Watch modifications. That's just an example.
Gentlemen.
Thank you. This reads to me as the creation of a joint powers authority. So my question is, would it help to say that? Does it give any more value to these amendments if it's a joint powers authority and then it would have all the sanctions that state law allows it to have?
So the real distinction between a successor entity, so a JPA would be a successor entity, is the continuity of the FORA CFD. And in order for the FORA CFD to continue, it is legally required for FORA to continue in some form, not a new or different entity. So what is happening here is the FORA organization is continuing in order to continue the CFD, but its powers, instead of being very broad and dealing with the planning, establishing the planning, putting the plans in place, now are substantially narrowed to just the continuation and the collection and the management of the financing district, the property tax, the contingency provisions of the property tax revenue, and the transition plan. So that's why it's not framed as an automatic JPA or a new or different entity. So that's why you wouldn't have JPA. But you're right, it does read a little bit like a JPA because, as all of you might recall, during some of the initial adoption of the transition plan, we suggested a JPA as a potential way to go forward in the absence of state legislation. And one of the issues with that has to do with the FORA CFD and ensuring that there's that replacement revenue mechanism in place. So you still would have needed some legislation for that.
Sir.
Thank you. I have a question regarding the letter from the Marina City Council around the point number 3. They say proposed legislation will continue to divert funds from local taxing entities and school districts. And they assert that the legislation will continue to collect what was formerly redevelopment property tax increment for an indefinite period. And this, they go on to say, will hurt education agencies. My question is that the executive director's or the legal opinion, is that accurate? And then 2, do we have an approximate amount of tax revenue that would not go to the districts, such as Monterey Peninsula, as a result of this?
Sherry, I know you want, or as Sherry mentioned earlier, the limited uses of tax increment under this proposal have to do with the unmet obligations that have to do with litigation or unfunded liabilities that may come from PERS. There's a limited list of those. And so, Sherry, if I have it correct, that would probably carry on for some period, but not indefinitely.
Yeah, this is designed, again, to be the stopgap, to address any contingent liabilities going forward, but at the same time, it allows the successor board, in fact, requires the successor board to make an evaluation on an annual basis to determine if it retains all of those revenues or if it passes it back to the county auditor for redistribution. And I would note that although Marina has raised this issue, Marina has also issued some bonds in its redevelopment area. So the property tax revenues that are generated inside the city of Marina, it's very possible the ones that FORA collects will go back to the city of Marina and not be redistributed either, because it will go to retire a bond debt that they have issued or are issuing. So yes, there will be a retention of the revenues like now for some period of time. We're not sure what that period of time is, although there's a mechanism in play to allow the pass-through and the kickback of those revenues if they are not needed.
And is there an estimate of how much property tax is currently being collected that would otherwise go to a school district?
I don't know about the number that passes through directly to the school district. I know that the FORA amount of property tax collection is in the $4 to $5 million a year range. So and it would be anticipated as development continues across the base to go up over time. I think one report that I saw, it was, I just don't remember the numbers, I'm sorry.
Mr. Wizard, do you have another question, sir?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. In an earlier question, Ms. Damon, you were asked about the carrying out of the administrative tasks of whatever might be in place after June 30th of 2020, and you mentioned that a land use jurisdiction or some member of some board could obligate one of their employees, if they so chose, to perform those tasks. And if that is not the choice of whatever members may or may not exist, if nobody wants to commit their professional staff, an option could be for the successor to hire someone to carry out those tasks. With us actively terminating our contract with the Public Employees Retirement System, how might this future successor employ somebody? Would it be an at-will position with no benefits? Would we consult with some staffing agency that would not have any kind of pension liabilities? How would that go about so as to limit financial liability to successors?
The idea of this legislation is to preserve that flexibility to your successor board so that they get to make that determination and evaluation at the time that it becomes an issue. And so, yes, all of those things that you just talked about, if they didn't want to pay any retirement, the other idea is you could have a contract that requires the employee to do 100% of its contribution to CalPERS, so there would be no terminated agency liability at the end of the day. So you do have lots of different options. You have consultants, you have other use of some member agency staff where the underlying land use jurisdictions are bearing that cost, absorbing that cost.
Thank you. Through the chair, one more. Thank you. I understand that the California State University is an organ of the state. Are community colleges also similarly empowered? Are they also considered a state agency?
Yes.
And so if that's the case, can anyone and professional staff describe what differences might exist between municipal government in the form of cities and counties and the powers bestowed upon them as it relates to the sovereignty of the state, and how that might work in a successor board where there are members who have different legal authority?
That's a very complicated question, but it is not uncommon for state educational institutions to partner or cooperate with the local jurisdictions that they work with. I've personally done that in my career. The University of California, California State University, and the junior colleges all across the state have partnership arrangements. In the case of CSUMB, they've already agreed to pay taxes and to seek approvals under state law, and I think there's state Supreme Court position that says that they have to, for certain kinds of activities, they have to go through the city of Marina for permitting, for example. The University of California has agreed to pay the developer fees, the Community Facilities District for the private developments that occur on the UCM best properties. So there have been agreements that have been made between jurisdictions already. They do operate similarly to jurisdictions, but they don't have zoning and code enforcement per se, but all of their land use planning entitlement processes go through the Board of Trustees in the case of the California State University, or University of California, the Board of Regents, where they adopt certain uses for property when it's according to the mission. When it's according to a local jurisdictional or a private company, it goes through a jurisdictional approval process. That's a snapshot of what's much more complicated answer, but I can give you those examples that I'm personally aware of.
So then my next question, and hopefully last one, Mr. Chair, would be if for some reason there was some falling out, there was some unfavorable third-party decision that affected the relationship amongst the members of the successor, could the successor or any member thereof compel or bind the action of a state agency or organ to complete some task that they did not want to?
Not as it pertained to the mission of the sovereign entity. If it was part of an activity that was, for example, CSUMB's partner arrangements where they're private developments, there definitely that definitely could take place there, but not in the others. No.
Well, and I would say, and don't forget, your successor board is not empowered to compel anybody to do really anything. It's a very limited scope successor agency. So you aren't dealing with land use planning consistency requiring them to do anything. If you were enforcing the writ or the settlement agreement to pay money, that could fall under the successor board. But I know that CSUMB has its toes on the line and it's ready to fulfill its obligations under that agreement.
We're going to go to Gail, and then we'll be down to you, and then we'll go to the public.
Thank you. So I want to follow up. PK, I'm following up on your question. So please, if you don't mind. The City of Marina did write a letter with regard to the tax increment coming from under the authority of the Health and Safety Code. And that tax increment, if it's not paid to FORA, would go back to the taxing agencies, just as when the RDA, the redevelopment agencies concluded in 2011, except if it is already obligated. And the State Department of Finance allowed all the jurisdictions to have their previously obligated redevelopment funds continue to fulfill those contractual obligations. The same would exist if this tax increment went away. So it's Marina's understanding the largest proportion of that money would be restored to K through 14 grade levels, which is what you're looking at. And my concern also is that if, in fact, when I asked questions earlier about the funding for these administrative costs, which Director Wizard was just also asking for, because City of Marina would not have staffing available to backfill anything. We're strapped. So looking at our 5 jurisdictions, I'm very concerned about how we would pay for this administrative cost of this operation. And if, in fact, we're limiting the tax increment, as Mr. Hulamar just said, to repayment of a currently existing CalPERS obligation and to litigation cost, and then we're going to restore it back to the taxing authority for distribution to schools, county, underlying jurisdictions, where is the use of this money to pay for the administrative costs? Because you've now given 2 inconsistent answers, and I'm trying to get clarity. The most important driving objective here is for us to look at the CFD, committing the CFD to the actual things that it's authorized to do, which is not administrative costs, but doing the improvements all of our jurisdictions want, but making sure also that we don't create a structure where jurisdictions are required to backfill for the cost of of an organization. So I'm asking for that clarification.
I'm not sure I'm not even sure I followed that all the way.
If you're limiting the tax increment to fulfillment of CalPERS ongoing obligations existing as of 2020 and litigation costs existing as of 2020, and giving it back after that, what's the source of funds for running this business?
So I'm not sure that Mr. Hulamard was over-inclusive in his answer. The way the legislation is drafted, there is an escrow account, and it can fund those two things, absolutely. But it could also fund the staffing and some other things. It's a contingent liability. The staffing level of the successor agency, I would put in the category of contingent liability. As you move forward. And that is the only other source of funds you would have. It's either you underlying land use jurisdictions, meaning not just you, Gail, but
Right, I got it.
you collectively, or it is how else do you do it? How are you going to pay for a consultant? Because I can guarantee you they aren't going to work for free.
Right.
Somebody's going to have to pay them
So
for
that is the diversion of tax increment from the taxing authorities,
But-
which includes K through 14
but-
schools, to this entity,
But
correct?
in all fairness, let's just talk about that for a minute. Right now, FORA has 16 FTE to do its job, which is, where's my little slide here? Whoops. You know, that one. We do all that stuff there. You're talking about limiting a very narrow, limited scope of an agency. I think we've estimated during the transition plan hearing process 3 or 4 people to collect fees, manage the CIP with consultant costs. Your costs are radically different. The costs for the successor agency are relatively small. Marina has already opined, and I believe your staff opined, oh yeah, we can do the planning stuff. We can send a bill. We know how to do that. Okay, so that's one task already off this list. You already have the capability to do it, and your people are asserting that they can do it. So I don't think we're not talking about $17 million over 10 years, or even $1 million. I don't know what the cost is, but the idea with this legislation is to preserve the flexibility to the successor board. One vote is marinas, one vote is counties, one vote is seasides, to make, and let me not forget anybody else, but anybody else who's on that board, to make those decisions and address how to most efficiently operate and fulfill these obligations. It's not an apple to an apple with the existing organization versus what the very limited scope of the successor entity, the successor board needs to do.
The same would be true if the CFD is currently structured in a way that the overhead and administrative costs for managing the CFD come out of the CFD fund. So there's, we're not duplicating funds here. It would be a portion based on what the work is. And I think the work in terms of handling the unfunded actuarial liability costs or those items are a small part of what the successor board would do.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is with regard to item K2 specifically, because we do know that the CFDs under H3 are limited to what's to pay for under the CIP as of June 30th, 2020, including water augmentation. And within that, there's insufficient amounts to pay for the water augmentation that would need to go forward. There's not enough that's going to be in there. And so we're going to get to K2 right away, which is this idea that we need to find funding to pay for water augmentation. And under the current language, it says underlying land use jurisdictions. And I guess my first question, because MCWD is moving forward looking at our master planning and identifying impact fees, does this language that does not define MCWD under land use jurisdiction, does this limit that in any way?
I don't think that it does, because we've tried to capture MCWD in the concept of the regional water provider language there. So MCWD definitely comes into habitat, water supply augmentation. So we've tried to capture MCWD in the conversation here. But if it's really that short, that's definitely an issue that should be raised with the administrative committee now. And if the FORA CFD needs to be amended, it should be addressed now. I know MCWD is doing its own planning, and it goes to the Water Wastewater Oversight Committee, and that has a big budget and it has plans. That conversation should be coming out and being addressed, in my opinion, with the admin folks and the technical people now.
And I guess then a follow-up then, as that's being addressed, is how do we reconcile clarifying what the successor agency would be saying they're collecting for versus what MCWD? Because if we're calling it water augmentation here, and it's maybe a tiny portion of that, I think there may be some confusion. So that is just maybe a question, is how do we see that being reconciled?
So this actually was drafted to be not just MCWD. It was ideally, it would be MCWD and Monterey 1. And so in my staff report, I talk about Monterey 1, who gets a piece of the water augmentation dollars that the FORA CFD generates. So the idea here was to make sure it wrapped around the water supply, water augmentation issues. The only thing I might expand here is to call out water supply augmentation and water supply, if that would make it clearer that we want everybody at the table on the big regional needs issues that we've heard all throughout the process. Does that address your concern?
To a degree, I think there needs to be an understanding that when we're talking water augmentation here, it isn't to get us to where the ultimate end is. And there's more to what's going to be in the CIP and more to M1 Water and Monterey and our district's costs within the CIP. There's a whole lot more yet to go. And so I just don't want that to be misrepresented here.
You don't want to be limited. You don't want to be limited.
When we say water augmentation here, it isn't all the water augmentation that needs to be done, and so there's going to be other things collected.
This isn't limited. This just says as a regional need. It does not limit it.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to the public. For any public
Chair, I may. Can I make one more comment?
Comment or question, sir? We're coming back for comments.
Comment.
Thank you. We'll now open the microphone for the public to comment on this issue. You have 3 minutes.
Oh, I can actually see.
Good morning. This is working? Yes. Okay, great. Good morning, Mike DeLappa, Land Watch, Monterey County. Somehow, between your approval of a transition plan in December and this past Monday, when your staff released its legislative proposal, the wheels went off the bus. We ask that you get a new legislative bus. Let's start with the obvious. Your staff's proposed amendments are inconsistent with the legislative mandate to sunset FORA in 2020. They would perpetuate FORA until the final building permit is pulled for any approved project that has an obligation to pay the CFD tax or to contribute to, quote, a replacement funding mechanism. In essence, FORA would exist virtually forever. Your staff's proposal also ignores what local governments have repeatedly asked for: autonomy in future planning and infrastructure development. The legislative proposal would authorize the FORA CFD board to, 1, decide what counts as the regional needs for, quote, habitat management, transportation, transit, and water supply augmentation. 2, decide when and what projects to fund. And 3, distribute or not distribute for those projects, money for those projects. The proposal also requires that the land use agencies, quote, continue to fund regional needs. The FORA CFD board would therefore continue to have essentially the same powers over infrastructure it has now. And then there's the problem of the CEQA exemption. As drafted, the proposed amendments provide a broad CEQA exemption for future implementation actions that goes well beyond mere organizational changes. The law requires that FORA creates a transition plan and sunset. That means end. There are so many problems with your staff's proposal, as Land Watch attorney John Farrow has pointed out in exacting detail in 2 letters, that your only option in meeting the legislative sunset requirement is to scrap everything your staff has done Go back to the transition plan and develop language that is consistent with that plan and responsive to local government's wishes for autonomy. Don't try to fix the legislative bus. Please get a new one. And I also want to say that there is no way in the last 4 days to react to all the changes today. This really demands thoughtful legal review. And I don't know how many lawyers there are here, but I can tell you our attorneys spent hours looking at this, and I would hope each jurisdiction would take the same time with their attorneys to look at it. There is a very important disconnect between the presentation and the language. Those two things are not the same. Read the language. It is very different from what you heard today. And as to this deadline, we've known for 20 years that FORA was going to go out of business. It just seems a bit disingenuous today to be worried about a deadline when we've had a 20-year notice. So I ask you to go back. Please do not adopt this legislation. Ask your attorneys. This will bind you to things you do not want to be bound to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ron Cheshire, Monterey Santa Cruz Building Trades Council. Can you please go to the chart with the green dots on it? Thank you. Where there aren't any green dots on the right-hand side, who's going to be responsible for all of that? One of our biggest questions is, you're dealing with the dissolution of the current board structure and all of its responsibilities. Where's the mention of who's going to take over? How are they going to take over? What responsibilities are they going to have? You ask for power to go ahead and ensure that your contracts are fulfilled in item 6 up at the beginning. Don't even go to it right now. I think it's number 6. I just want to note that this board and the jurisdictions have never held up to any of their contracts. You've basically created a culture of thievery out here, and you've never protected the working people. And to sort of paraphrase Nancy Pelosi, you're not worth suing. You know. Now you also call out that you want to have the powers outlined in Chapter 4 and 5. Well, for years you've been telling me you don't even know what the hell some of those powers are. You better look whether you can regulate, how are you going to be able to regulate it and stuff. You better get that clear first. Because we've been told you do not know what that means. If you want the power, you better know what the power is. And then in regards to the prevailing wages and the housing issue, the affordable housing, I don't know one of you hasn't had any trouble in your jurisdiction keeping up with the 15% that the state mandates. We want to know how that's going to be enforced, how it's going to take place. The underlying question to all of this is, okay, you're going to go ahead and dissolve. Who's going to take over? Who's going to be responsible? We want to know. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I just want to follow up on Jane's question about the location of the language on prevailing wage and affordable housing. Sherry and I can rival each other for knowledge of all the documents, the reuse plan, and that language is not in the reuse plan. It's in the master resolution. So the statement that continuing the reuse plan will continue those provisions is not legally binding. Doesn't have any meaning. So maybe what we could do is, if there's a second meeting, maybe Sherry could issue a memo that actually cites how the reuse plan contains those provisions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Board members, Gary Curcio. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Monterey County Hospitality Association. As most of you know by now, you've heard me say it enough times, we represent 27,000 employees in Monterey County, the biggest employer on the Monterey Peninsula. Our number one concern remains the problem our employees have living within 20 to 25 minutes of their jobs. They're making long commutes twice a day, 40, 45 minutes, based on traffic, 50 minutes, and it's just not acceptable. Our county has a reputation of paralysis through analysis. It is, to me and our association, the staff recommendation seems to be a good and legitimate compromise to allow this process to continue moving forward. The more we delay, the more our employees are going to remain in those traffic lines and long commutes on for years to come. The time has come that somebody take the responsibility to actually not only talk about affordable housing, get some affordable housing built. And based on that, we strongly recommend that the directors accept the staff recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Seeing no one else, we're going to close public comment and bring it back to the board. I know there's arms of waving for comment. Should we start to my left this time?
Well, I think it's clear legislation is necessary, and the timing, I don't think we have much more time to move forward on this. The county had some input into this language, as some other jurisdictions did. Our legislative committee heard this. We voted 4-1 to move forward on it. I'm comfortable with most of the alternatives that were suggested. I feel strongly that the university ought to remain a partner in this. They're one of the few landhold jurisdictions that's really done something productive. And frankly, if this board goes a different way, I'm going to ask the county to ask Senator Monning to move forward with legislation in any event, because I think it's absolutely necessary, and I don't want to see the county get stuck holding the bag.
Thank you. Come back to
I wanted to make a comment earlier to Keith's point, and that really is Delray Oaks' point, is that we see the necessity of this CFD going forward for just those kind of issues. You know, that water augmentation discussion, what limited infrastructure investment can be made, and then habitat. I mean, it's critical for us. And so we absolutely need this to go forward, and I just wanted to basically agree with what you were bringing up.
Mr. Wizard, comment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's very interesting comments from the representative from the Monterey County Hospitality Authority, or agency rather, excuse me. I'll just note that the median income in Monterey County is $63,876, which is $31 an hour roughly. And I'd be curious to know how many employees in that organization make $31 an hour. And if there's such a need for affordable housing, we could either pay people more or build housing where they work. There's great movement around employer-sponsored housing, and I'd love to see our hospitality partners join in on the fun. As it relates to our discussion here about proposed legislation, I'll say that I'm very much worried about staffing issues and how we're going to solve that problem. I think that with Ms. Damon's comment that replacement financing mechanisms such as CREAs and CFDs could be established for the underlying land use jurisdictions, which could then, based on implementation agreements and transition plan agreements, whatever successor exists could be required to accept those alternate funding mechanisms. It kind of begs the question, well, then what's the point of this continuation of the CFD? What is the necessity behind it if the underlying land use jurisdictions could just do it themselves, as it relates to what was proposed? I'm also concerned about the Section C of 67-700, where it addresses the permissibility of changing the transition plan, and how that might then go to Section B, where if we're changing the transition plan, we can change what it is we're changing within the act because we're allowed to make the rules of how this act works for the purposes of carrying out base-wide mitigations. So it seems as though there's this limitation around what our scope is, but we reserve the right to modify that if that's necessary. So that there's not a lot of clarity there as to what, are we going to stick to this mission or are we going to change it because we need to or because we want to? And a lot of what we've heard historically, granted, many of my colleagues here have been around this table longer than I have. It just doesn't seem as though FORA is the most trusted agency, not necessarily the people, but the activity that's come out of this board over the last 24 years has a lot of people frustrated. So to that end, I say that this appears to be just sort of a repackaging of the Fort Ordries Authority. And I don't know that the people of the city of Seaside who spoke to me when I knocked on their doors wanted that ultimately. And so specifically, the city of Seaside has been given notice that there is in the CIP, there no longer exists money to repair Eucalyptus Road and portions of General Jim Moore. And so a road that FORA built through the CIP that all of us pay taxes to fund is not going to be repaired because the money that was set aside for contingency has been reallocated and spent elsewhere. And so now we're on the hook to fix somebody else's road they built that they gave to us that we actually don't want. So if that's the kind of relationship we have with FORA today, what kind of relationship will we have with FORA in the future or whatever successor exists? And so the last thing I'll say is that while I appreciate that Marina has been successful in building their entitled projects and have realized a portion of what was envisioned as economic recovery, the city of Seaside has no entitled projects. And so if we're going to be taxing future projects, we're going to be taxing 100% of what Seaside does. Not 10% of it, not 80% of it. Every last thing that gets built in Seaside, whether it's today or in 2025, if this vehicle continues, the city of Seaside will divert 100% of its incoming tax revenue to fund other people's business. And the city of Seaside is the least capable, the least sufficient today, which is why we're trying to build those things to help our own folks. So I'm not necessarily excited about the idea of giving away tens of millions of dollars of Seaside's money to help people in other communities when we all have our own battles to fight, and 25 years later, we haven't gotten there.
She'll go first, then you, Alan, if that's all right.
Well, actually, I'm prepared to make a motion, and I'm sympathetic to what I've been hearing Seaside say. I'm also remembering that working as an agency, as a successor agency, will be more successful in building the financial needs and meeting the financial needs that each jurisdiction will be requiring. So with that in mind, I will move that we accept the staff report with the inclusion of the CSUMB as a member in the successor agency, and my suggestion would be that the agency may choose to add another person to get an odd number.
Second.
Okay. Alan?
Yeah, so I first just want to address my friend and colleague's comment about future projects that might become entitled. My understanding is that the legislation being contemplated would generate revenues from projects that are already entitled but have not drawn permits and the work has not been done. So I think that your concern is misplaced. I don't think that that would affect Seaside. I would urge people to support the motion because if we don't, we have a significant funding shortfall for things like transit. We have $9 million MST was planning on for buses. There's no plan to provide that money. We have 40-some million dollars, or 20 to 40, we don't really know, shortfall in habitat. There's no plan to supply that money. We have $18 million shortfall in water development and augmentation. No plan to supply that. So for us to essentially give a free ride to a developer who's gotten entitled projects, a $70 million free ride, while we have these public regional needs that will go unmet, that doesn't seem right. So I would encourage directors to support this motion. I don't believe that this will affect projects that would be entitled after June of 2020. This is not an extension of FORA in any real way. It's essentially a legal extension of it for the purpose of collecting money that is due to the public that will otherwise be lost. So, yeah.
Thank you. Do we have anybody on the phone that wanted to comment before I go to anybody that's patiently waiting?
Yes, please. This is Jane.
Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to just say that I'm really disappointed in this. You know, Senator Monning asked us to work together to come up with something that represented something close to a community agreement on what should happen. So he's looking for this legislative language to reflect better the interests of the entire community. And you know, the timeline was known for a long time, months, years, as has been said. This language was developed weeks ago, could have been developed longer ago than that, not shared. It wasn't brought forward to our FORA board or to the jurisdictions in any way that would allow for meaningful discussion, analysis, and input. The consultants who've been talking to all of the interested parties apparently were not used to help craft something that could be better for the entire region. So you know, I think if we had been serious as a FORA organization about really doing what Senator Monning asked, we would have seen something months ago, because there are a number of issues in here that need to be discussed by the jurisdictions, even as Director Garfield said, run past the council or the board. So that's the process. Then the document itself. I mean, there are multiple problems, and the underlying issue is that those problems are going to either inflame or create, rather than resolve, the differences, the distrust, and the legal issues that we have been discussing for a number of years. And with all due respect to Director Hoffa, if you look at the language in this legislative proposal, the language does not work presentation. So there's some seriously objectionable proposals. So basically, this is a never-ending version of FORA, and it completely contradicts all the discussions of short-term extension. There have been a lot of words about limits shrinking. If you read the language, that's not what's going on. In terms of the membership, there is a disrespect for the either the amount of CFD that might be paid by the different jurisdictions or the acreage involved. This question of weighted voting or how we're going to deal with this, it's complicated. To have the jurisdictions to work out for the last minute like this. We can't do it on the fly. It's too complicated. Another issue in there is that a vote is being given to an educational institution that is not paying CFD fees, and it's not subject to the base plan. Third issue is there's a lot of deceptive and unenforceable language in this. For instance, we have a paragraph called regional planning that states that the reuse plan continues to apply to the jurisdiction. Well, that sounds nice, except that then, the very next phrase says, it opens up a major loophole, which is that any jurisdiction can declare that the base plan is inapplicable, which completely negates the statement that it continues to apply. Then we have the regional funding section, which says that each city can create its own CFD, but only if the city's CFD funds FORA's regional project, which is legally impossible because of nexus issues. So basically, the city CFDs can't be established, and this new FORA would continue for decades. And then saying that the affordable housing and prevailing wage provisions of the base reuse plan should continue, that's really deceptive, because the prevailing wage and the 20% affordable housing requirement are in the master resolution. So this language does not address the concerns of those who want to see prevailing wage continue and a 20% requirement extended. To the contrary, it may put those very things at risk. So I don't think we would be wise to try to rewrite this on the spot today. It's really fatally flawed, I believe, or even try to give staff our input for a rewrite. I would propose that the cities of Seaside and Marina and the county convene and develop much shorter, much simpler language that extends the CFD for 2 years or until existing developers, not using the term entitled projects because that includes properties that have no developers, until existing developers and the jurisdiction have an agreement for the payment of CFD fees to the city, whichever comes first, so the 2 years or an agreement. The distribution of that money can be the subject of the implementing agreements that we're all working on and not something we try to deal with in the legislation. Monterey and Delray Oaks don't have existing developers, so that's why I'm not including them in this conversation. And besides, coordinating the calendars of 3 jurisdictions is probably going to be more than enough. I don't think it can be done in 1 week, but maybe in 2 weeks we can come up with something that much better reflects the conversation and the realities that we've been discussing through the development of the transition plan and through to today. So I think it would be really inadvisable for us to send this to Senator Monning. It does not do what he asked us to do, and I think it may create more problems than it solves. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Any further discussion before we have a vote on this matter?
Just one.
Well, Andre, and then we'll go to Gail.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to thank also the judge or the supervisor for your comments on some of the progress that the universities have made since FORA came into existence. I've been here for about 5.5, 6 years now when Dr. Ochoa asked me to come back and work with him at the university. And FORA was one of the first. Hello.
Go right
Who is
ahead.
that? Sorry about
There.
that. FORA was one of the first organizations that Dr. Ochoa really wanted to focus on. The prior president had his government relations person being the main person representing Cal State University Monterey Bay. And Dr. Ochoa changed that so that he became a member of this board so that he could see what was happening firsthand and put his input in, even though we were not a voting member. He always wondered to me why we weren't a voting member from the beginning of FORA, and I know there were some legal concerns with that. But Dr. Ochoa wanted to become a voting member ever since he got here 6.5, 7 years ago, by virtue of how much land the university owns and controls, our water issues, and just basically being a steward of place in the region as a university. Almost every city, almost every agency that I see at this board has come onto our campus. We've either hosted events with you or invited you to events. So I find now some members wanting us to not have a vote to be problematic for us going forward. It's almost punitive. That said, we would like to be a voting member in whatever entity succeeds FORA. It's like an arithmetic problem. I'd like to tell my colleague from Seaside, the councilman wizard, that it's like 1 + 1 = 2. FORA's work isn't finished yet. So what the heck are you getting rid of it for and getting rid of the CFD if the Habitat Conservation Plan, water issues, infrastructure issues, our friend from the Agency for Tourism and, what was it? Hospitality, one of our big majors on campus. I think you might be referring to some of the people I see on that 68 freeway coming in from Salinas and East Salinas in the morning to work at all the hotels and be maids and all that stuff here. Those are the low-income people who need affordable housing, but they have affordable housing where they live, kind of in East Salinas, and they drive an hour each way is what I actually heard, not 45 minutes or half an hour. And these are people who have to then get people to take care of their kids, grandparents if they have them. So, yeah, you need another way to get in and out of this community. And again, I've only been here 5.5, 6 years, so I'm not really of the community. I don't have the history that our esteemed mayor from Salinas has, that Michael Hulamart has been running this thing for 20 years has. But I can tell you right now that what Monning wanted was everyone to try to get together. And he once told us when we went to Sacramento that this board was the one place where everyone gets together and talks. Okay, so we may not be able to get to what Supervisor Parker was referring to, complete agreement that we can give him and it's all wrapped up in a beautiful bow. That's not going to happen because, you know, what you're involving here are humans. And whenever you have humans, you have disagreements. Okay, so you know, we're going to get to where we can and get there as best as we can. It's not going to be perfect, but until the work of FORA is finished, some successor agency has to inure, or else the work isn't going to be finished, and this entire region is going to suffer for it. Okay? And I'm not going to be here forever. I'm going to leave. I might come back and retire here because it's so beautiful. But you all need to kind of figure something out. Again, it's the worst form of government ever, per Winston Churchill, but it's better than everything that came before it. So let's work together and make it happen.
Thank you. Got two of you. Who wants to go first?
Thank you. Thank you. Marina agrees that we need to collect the CFD. Our posture has never been any different than that. And Marina does not believe that this legislative proposal is the fix for doing that. But we can get to what is necessary to make sure that our entitled projects continue to pay the CFD going forward. Our concern about this proposal is it's too broad, it's ambiguous, it's vague. Part of the problem is that the CIP also that this is going to fund. I think there's a belief here among those speaking that if all of the CFD is collected post-2020, that this new board, this new oversight entity will be able to fulfill the capital improvement program. And all you have to do is go back and look at the documentation that the FORA staff has put forward to this board in its entirety, to the transition plan, is that the CFD funding will raise post-2020 approximately $127 million. The estimate of the capital improvement program costs as of 2016, when that first started coming before us, was $194.5 million. So even if you extend this entity until we collect the last of the Community Facilities District contribution, we are not going to be able to implement the capital improvement program. That's the reason for the discussion about what funds are being obligated for the fulfillment going forward after 2020. Because each of us as jurisdictions need to understand if it's CFD funds that are being committed, it will not fulfill the capital improvement program. So where's the stopgap for us to backfill if that's your intention? What the current FORA structure was put forward in the transition plan was that was going to come from tax increment. That's the tax increment that's being questioned now. Is that going to be continued to be collected? In the last year's budget, we were putting 1.6 million of 2.9 million approximately, this is the 2018 budget, into fulfillment of the capital improvement program. But we've heard two statements here, is that we're only going to continue to take the tax increment away from the underlying jurisdictions, taxing entities, including schools, including the county, including the underlying jurisdictions that would get their tax increment, after we fulfill CalPERS, after we fulfill litigation, and then any other obligations that are going to be imposed by this new agency. So to complete your capital improvement program, that tax would need to be continued to be committed ad infinitum. We don't know when that would cease to be applied. So those are inconsistencies that exist in this legislation, and I think is of concern to the school district. The county had a staff report that indicated in the next 6 years, their share of that tax increment was estimated by their own staff to be $23 million that would go to the county rather than to this follow-up organization. For the city of Seaside, when looked at by the Wilden Agency, when you were considering Monterey Downs, they identified that if FORA went away, your 8 cents to the dollar of property tax would increase to 18 cents per dollar of property tax collected. So you would be continuing, Seaside would be continuing to contribute that to meet the goal of this structure that's being created. The key point, and I agree with what Director Parker said, and I do think, contrary to what Mr. Lewis just said, I do think we can get there. I do think that what I've heard here today is that we all want the CFD to go forward and we want it to be effective. But I think as jurisdictions, we also want to analyze that we're not committing additional dollars that are going to have to come from other revenue sources that our cities rely on. And this structure has a missing element there that we don't know where those funds are going to come from. I would urge us to go forward with further discussions. I know at the admin committee, I think there was a discussion about trying to modify the CIP to address that we continue a CFD to fund the habitat, to fund the existing approved road projects, South Boundary Road and a couple of other roads, that we were looking at funding transit and allowing the jurisdictions to take on their own roads as to when those would be built and how we would do that. I think that that strategy may be necessary for us to look at, and that alternative can be developed within the next week as to moving forward with an entity for us to collect the CFD and actually be successful. I don't think this is the structure that allows us to do it.
Mayor, you're up.
I think I'll be pretty short and brief. As it currently is written, I can't support the draft legislation. We went back and we had a conversation with our council, and they want to do away with FORA. They don't want to have nothing to do with FORA. They don't want to have nothing to do with the CFD. They think they should be able to keep all their money, and as I informed them, they may have responsibilities that we may not be able to afford, and they said fine with that. But as I sit here, I think it's important that we do sit together as cities and try to figure it out how the land use jurisdictions go forward 2020 and then bring that back to the wider board. And it's something similar to what Supervisor Parker laid out. It really has to be the entities sitting in that room going back and forth with their representatives. Right now you have the the RGS, and I just met with them, and they said the CIP is not the current CIP 2020. It's what we can afford, and what I told them at a certain length in that list of projects, we're going to cut it off because we don't want FORA or the agency to continue, and we don't have the money. So my point is, it's conversations that are taking place that the rest of the board don't know about, but you're asked to vote on it, and you're asked to decide these issues, and you're asked to help us work through it. But if you're not part of the continuing agreements with the land use jurisdictions, how can you really weigh in at this time? Because we haven't agreed to some of the things we have to agree to, and then the things that are not a question of whether we're going to agree to them or not, it's whether that jurisdiction wants to participate in that entity or not. So it's so many moving parts that we're asked to sign up for now, and I understand the legislation can be changed, but the only way it's changed is if us as a body meet back here again to vote once or vote twice to push it in there. And I just think whether it's 5 or 6, and I think CSUMB made some good comments, because I think there's people on my council that was not appreciative of CSUMB being on the list, and I understood that, but now that I hear a different language being spoken about the importance of having CSUMB and other land use jurisdictions in there, then we're open to that. But as it stands today, moving this forward, when we haven't even signed some of the agreements, you guys have not seen the agreements, I don't know how we lock ourselves in, but I heard Supervisor Phillips say what he said, so I think as we continue to talk, if it moves forward, it may line up. So those are my comments. I understand, I see all of the unanswered questions. For me, I have a concern with the Veterans Cemetery Endowment parcel. We don't speak to that. I want to make sure that the veterans are protected and the endowment parcel is protected. And I think a public comment about prevailing wage and the 20% set aside is not in the reuse document. So who are we speaking to that? I know for Seaside, we're committed to that, but as we move forward, how do we ensure that other communities, other entities are doing the same? Thank you.
I was going to comment, but go right ahead.
I just want to point out that multi-jurisdictional joint powers authorities that form community facilities districts can be formed without state legislation. So as a backup, the university does support the continuation of the CFD, but that's another alternative without requiring state legislation.
Before we vote, as a jurisdiction that's been on this board from the beginning, that has paid their dues to vote at every year, we send our check in very diligently. I find this rather disheartening that we have this many electeds in the room that can't make a decision, right, wrong, or indifferent, knowing that the clock's been running. Our agency has provided water that's going to Seaside. We send our 1 million gallons a day over to you guys. We haven't sent you a bill. Maybe we should. I don't know the answer to that. We've worked with the county diligently. We've worked with Marina, and we provide the workforce for the Monterey Peninsula. No matter what anybody says, yes, those people come from Salinas. They come from East Salinas. And there is not enough housing in Seaside. In Monterey, they can't afford the $900,000 homes in Marina. They're very nice, by the way. They can work at the hotel over here, and they can work in your restaurants. And the carpenters are now going to come from Salinas to build your new homes. But as you don't end this in any kind of a fashion today when we vote, I can almost guarantee you it's going to end come June if I have to go there and tell the Senate that I personally feel it needs to end. There's been enough money spent, and we vote twice on everything. Maybe the 24 years, a lot more would have been accomplished if it had been a majority vote and we didn't have to have a unanimous vote on everything and bring it back the next month. As I've watched that, you know, insanity is something that fits in real well here. So whatever happens to FORA or the next organization, I think you need to figure out how to vote that you don't need y'all to agree on what day it is. And as we've talked about this, it's rather disheartening to see all the work that goes in and we still aren't there yet. So I'm going to ask the clerk to call for the roll call vote.
And just a clarification, the motion was
to include the university.
To include the university and the proposed amendments?
Yes.
Okay.
Director Parker? Director Gunter,
Yes.
Director O'Connell,
No.
Director Morton. No. Director Adams is not here. Director Phillips.
Yes.
Director Carbone.
Yes.
Director Reimers.
Yes.
Director Hoffa.
Yes.
Director Gagliotti.
Yes.
Director Wizard. No. Excuse me. Director Oselby.
No.
And Director Garfield.
Yes.
7-5.
Thank you very much. We now have to open public comment. Is there anyone in the public that would like to comment?
Just a question, was that a vote to move forward the legislation or a vote to simply add CSUMB to the list? It wasn't clear because the supervisor's question was asking whether this is a vote on CSUMB being added to the list, but the original motion was to approve moving forward with the legislation, so I'm confused.
The way I understood the clarification was that it was moving forward with the 4 points presented here, with the recommended adjustments that were submitted and including California State University, Monterey Bay. That,
Right.
that was what I understood.
So it rejected the modifications that took CSU off of the board.
That's correct.
That's what I understood.
Seeing no one else, we'll close public comment. Any items from members?
Special meeting?
Thank you. This meeting's adjourned.
Chair, we
Thank you.
will need to have a second vote since this is a substantive matter that would,
So we have to schedule another meeting?
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thursday at 9 a.m. next week.
Okay.
Friday?
Make sure you get a phone number if you can't attend to vote.
Ne- Thir-
I'm sorry, what?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Supervisor.
There are Brown Act requirements for telephone participation. We have to know where you're going to be. It has to be publicly accessible.
Has to be
and
posted and the
it
door
has
has
to be
to be
posted at both places.
Okay. This meeting's adjourned Thursday at 9 a.m. See you then.